All right. It was like nothing we'd ever seen before, said Sheriff Brian Hawthorne at an interview on Tuesday after the body of Christian Rollins was found mangled and dead on the in the front lawn of the place where she was a caretaker. The medical examiner said that she died from severe blood loss due to feral pig attack. Christian Rollins was known for her compassion and thoughtfulness for others, and on her way to her caretaker job in Anahuac, Texas, on the morning of November 26, 2019, when she was leaving her vehicle, she stumbled upon bedding feral hogs and spooked them, causing them to attack. She was able to fight them off, but not before they inflicted critical injuries that she later died from and was found around 30 minutes to an hour later whenever the elderly couple came out and saw her. There have been around 100 feral pig assaults in the last 80 years, 4 which have been fatal in Texas. And feral pigs are known to roam from place to place in different habitats. And part of the reason for this is because of the constant development of industrial areas that pushes them to different places. So for this thesis, there's going to be a few different limitations. The first limitation is going to be that it's going to only be talking about North America. The reason for this is because we have good, reliable sources, and this is also where we live. So this is where it's our priority. This is where it's our number one sort of thing. The second is going to be, I'm not going to present a solvency. I'm just going to kind of present the issue, why something needs to be done, what's causing it, but I'm not going to try and say how we can fix it, because that's a whole nother thesis in itself. Lastly is that I'm not going to talk about any political issues, because yes, I'm going to be talking about hunting, which has to do with guns, and there's been a lot of talk about guns and what to do with them in the politics recently, so I'm going to stay away from that whenever question time comes around, because there's a lot pertaining to that. Okay. So with some history and background, the era before the 1920s was called the Progressive Era, and it brought a lot of reforms such as child labor laws and women's suffrage. During this time, the biggest thing was that these people showed an overwhelming support for conservation. Part of the reason was because this was leading up to the 1920s, where industrialization was evolving very rapidly, and it's causing cities to be crowded, and people wanted to get away from everything, and they wanted to go enjoy the outdoors and be able to just spend some time alone in the quiet, fish, hunt. This sort of ideology carried on when FDR became president, and he enacted the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, on April 5th, 1933. What this is what it allocated the U.S. $10 million for emergency work services, and the mission for it was to put unemployed Americans to work and kind of boost the economy, because with the Great Depression going on during the 30s, the economy was down and Americans weren't working at all. Also, the jobs they were given were stuff like to plant trees, build dams, and preserve old battlefields. This was all good because these trades that these people learned were passed down through generations and are still around today. So I'm going to go over the few different topics we're going to be talking about. The first one is going to be conservation hunting, like I talked about earlier. This is kind of a way of weeding out invasive species, and it's a way that's been used for hundreds of years. Then I'm going to get into the dominion mandate for my second point. Dominion mandate, for those who don't know, is a command by God to have dominion over animals and to have stewardship when to ruling over them, I guess you'd say. And then the last is going to be conserving and preserving habitats, which is the idea of creating or preparing new habitats, or even trying to bring back ones that were destroyed previously. For conservation hunting, one of the earliest examples of this is the waterfowl in Canada. The early Canadian settlers, whenever they got there, there was a bunch of untouched prairie lands filled with waterfowl, and they were plentiful, and they even said that they blocked out the sun. As the settlers started to settle in, they started having different agricultural advances, and this caused for these habitats to be slowly destroyed or deplenished of their stuff that helped the waterfowl survive. And what was good is that these settlers start to notice that. So they got together, they put all their money together and formed something called Ducks Unlimited. What this was to sort of help maintain this population of diverse species instead of letting one get grow more than the other, and then having species where they're diminishing. And this diversity that happened caused for 11 different types of smaller species to grow, and the environment started to rebuild itself. The next example of this is Teddy Roosevelt, the cousin of FDR. Teddy Roosevelt, when he was young, he struggled with asthma. And even though asthma would act up in the outdoors, his family would still encourage him to go out there to appreciate the outdoors, which was good because the older he got, he became more curious. He started to hunt. He'd go outside and study different species. And he'd even start hunting big game such as bears, lions, and buffaloes. As he got older, he kind of went away from that for a little bit. He got married. And he ended up being a cattle rancher later on in his life. And this was whenever his wife passed away, and he started to get back in that area of liking conservation and the environment. So he created something called the Boone and Crockett Club, which was in 1887. The purpose of this was to unite hunters and help spread ethical hunting. And the 10 years after they made this, they started to notice that there was actually a decline in the big game that they were trying to help save. So they kind of had to change the rhetoric a little bit. And this is where we first see this sort of like hunting seasons pop up, because they noticed that if they didn't give the animals a break of hunting and just hunt them year round, never any time to regrow, then they were going to all die off. My last example for conservation hunting is the funding for conservation. So this is something that I really had never thought about until I started searching this up, was that even if a hunter isn't going out to hunt and consciously thinking that they're trying to serve conservative with how they're hunting, the money that they put in to buy stuff like license and fees and the fees they have, the firearms, the ammo, all that stuff comes back around. So I don't have the chart where y'all can see it, but just imagine a pie chart and there's going to be 3 different areas for it. So the first chunk of it is going to be for state license and fees. So to hunt yearly, you have to buy a new license. This is also for fishing, you have to buy a license. That money plus different fees, depending on what types of hunts you're going on, all go into a conservation fund, which equals up to an approximate $796 million per year. Then for the second chunk, has to do with donations from different organizations such as Ducks Unlimited. They put this money together, and at the end of the year, they put that in there and add it to that whole fund. This equals up to $440 million. And then the last little area has to deal with tax on firearms, ammo, bows, stuff like that. Something I'd never known about, because there's an 11% tax on that stuff. And that 11% of tax goes back into this fund and equals up to about $371 million per year. So if you add all these together, this comes out to hunters with just the fees and the state license and the taxes from the firearms and donations equals $1.6 billion per year into this fund. And to kind of break that down, that means about $8 million per day. So this fund, other than going to different types of conservation work, also goes to help pay the salary of game wardens, research and wildlife law enforcement, and like people who work in state parks, those types of people. Which brings me back to my first point, is that even if these hunters don't actively think that they're conserving, the money that they're putting in is paying the salaries for people who actually care about that stuff, and that's what they want to do with their life. Next is the refutation. So a lot of people say that it's cruel and unfair because these animals have no chance, and that most people would want to enjoy watching wildlife instead of trying to kill it, and that the animal kingdom can deal with it on its own. It doesn't need man's help, or it doesn't need humans using weapons and calling it a sport. So my response to this is that yes, I agree that it could seem cruel, but you kind of take a deeper look at it, because by hunting and taking care of these different invasive species, you're stopping these invasive species from attacking these smaller groups of animals and destroying their environments, and possibly introducing new diseases to these animals to where they could go days, months, years just suffering because they can't get the right nutrition because they're out of their normal habitat, or they have some sort of disease, and they're just slowly dying instead of a quick death by hunting. Then with the animal kingdom doing its own to control the population, I agree that could work, but that could only work if humans weren't here. That's the problem. When humans showed up and we started putting our hand into the destruction of their environments and started making our habitats where their habitats used to be and pushing them out of their homes, then we have to also step in and help with rebuilding their habitats and giving them a place to live. So my next point of discussion is dominion mandate. And we're going to talk about God's dominion command, how you have to practice stewardship, and the relationship and the consumption of animals. So the Bible has historically been one of the most influential books throughout human history, and has served as a tool for God's commandments. And the verse that actually shows God's dominion mandate says, "You shall be fruitful, multiply, and replenish the earth, and have dominion over the birds of the air, and the fish of the sea, and the animals upon the land." This is a very clear command by God for humans to play their role in the wildlife community and to have dominion over them. This can be looked at as a direct command in some sense, but we're going to break it down into a few different examples to kind of get a better idea. With this commandment, men must follow a certain responsibility, which includes proper stewardship. And stewardship can be defined as one who is paid to manage the estate or property belonging to another. And this would mean that a man who is a steward is held accountable for any wise or unwise actions taken while managing over what he has been set to dominate over. So looking at stewardship in biblical terms, it'd be an action of being held accountable by God to do works that either he has commanded or that will bring praise to his name. There are different ways that Christians can conserve, whether or not it could be through the wise use of natural resources, the prevention of waste, and to stress the wide usage of renewable resources. A good example of a company or organization that does this is the National Forest Service. The conservation efforts of the Forest Service have been vast enough to increase the number of trees and habitats in the U.S., and that number only keeps rising. This can show how conservation efforts can be dealt with in a manner that practices dominion and stewardship over certain lands that have been trusted to them by God. Next, along with this dominion and being stewards to his creation, there comes up the idea of consuming animals and how God, what's God's take on that. The understanding of having dominion over certain species means that people can act at their own wills through this good and proper stewardship, which would entail the consumption of animals and how men should be merely managers of these animals. Whenever God told man to have dominion over his animals, he meant that man should help them prosper. And in the garden, the humans were even given the job to name the animals and care for them. These animals used to not be afraid of these humans, but whenever that apple was eaten and the sin was introduced into the world, that relationship changed from what God had originally intended. And we can see this in Genesis 9:2-3, which says, "The fear of you will fall on all the beasts of the earth and on all the birds in the sky, on every creature that moves along the ground, and on all the fish in the sea. They are given into your hands. Everything that lives and moves about will be food for you. Just as I gave you the green plants, I'll now give you everything." This verse is a prime example of how God saw the change in his original plans for mankind, and he clarified his new commandment for man to carry out. And this just shows a perfect act of stewardship and how God entrusts us to have that proper stewardship when consuming animals too. There's going to definitely be some refutations here. So a refutation would be the idea of a mandate from God and how man should act towards the environment. A very prominent refutation was from a gentleman named Derek Isaacs, who looks through a few different questions he is asked. Isaacs breaks down his differing views of blessings and commandments and how they would ultimately affect the dominion mandate and its overall meaning to God's people. Isaacs believes that the mandate, the act and the outcome of reproduction is in fact a blessing of the womb, instead of the result of obeying the command that God has commanded for us to follow. Isaacs also brings up another view of modern advances such as areas in medicines and technologies, and he says that these are not a demonstration of Adamic dominion, but rather a response to an adverse environment that is not recognizing man's role, which caused for defense mechanisms to be built. In the end, it is obvious that he does not believe in the Bible, and he does not think that the dominion has been given to us by God. And he also thinks that it was given to the Messiah instead of us. So in response to this, there are numerous examples and verses throughout the Bible that disprove this point. Looking at his view of reproduction, and that can be easily debunked with John 3:5, which says, Jesus answered, "Very truly I tell you, no one can enter the kingdom of God unless they are born of water and the Spirit." This verse alone shows that if a person is not born through God, then men will not be worthy to enter his kingdom, and that human's reproduction can't be a blessing of the womb. If this is true, then this means that the only way to achieve reproduction is through the command given out by God, which is the dominion mandate. Also, Isaac believes that man was never given the mandate to follow, and instead it was given. This, however, isn't true, and we can see that with Genesis 2:19, where it says, "And out of the ground the Lord God formed every beast of the field and every bird of the air, and he brought them to man to see what he would name each one. And whatever the man called each living creature, that was its name." When cross-referencing this with the verse, and cross-referencing this verse with our original verse, we see that when pertaining to the dominion mandate, it's obvious that God intended for man to have a close relationship with animals and be stewards towards his creation. And this leads into my last topic that I'm going to talk about, which is habitat conservation and preservation. So conservation and preservation is it's about protecting habitats. Then we're going to talk about habitat loss, and then we're going to look at a few different trusts that are showing what it's like to preserve habitats. So conservation of habitats is very important because in the big picture, we haven't really talked about it that much, but it's a very big idea in the whole picture. Conserving habitats includes preservation, protecting, and guarding various habitats in order to further their growth or stabilize the current state of the environment. Humans do many things that counteract these efforts, but there's also ways that humans have been helping and reasons why they should. And then we're going to investigate those a little bit deeper. So first, we're going to look at habitat loss. So habitat loss is looked at as one of the greatest threats to species diversity in the natural world, occurring when natural land cover or its aquatic equivalent is destroyed, fragmented, or degraded, usually as a result of human activity, which is by preservehabitats.org. There are a few prominent ways in which humans are destroying habitats, which include logging, oil and gas exploration, and draining swamps. Each of these acts has a very detrimental effect on the agriculture of these different environments that could possibly be in habitat that only that certain species of animal would be able to be sustained in. There are cases when these habitats aren't destroyed completely, but they may have been hurt enough that the habitat is not healthy enough to produce the proper nutrients needed for the species to survive. This causes for there to be fewer places for animals to survive in, and whenever this happens, these animals are pushed into areas that may not be proper for them, are into a habitat of human beings, which cause for interactions that don't need to be made, such as our story at the beginning where the caretaker was attacked by the pack of hogs. These interactions need to be slim to none, especially in heavy populated areas, and which is why humans need to step up and do their best to conserve the habitats of these species. Next, we're going to look at some trusts that have been put in place to help preserve some of these habitats. California has a few good examples of trusts that have been set up to protect these resources and habitats. And there are also types of regulations and codes set up that are must follow while operating anywhere near these trusts. And their main job is to put ownership on certain pieces of land so people can keep order and preserve the habitats for future generations of animals. The first trust is called Norfolk Wildlife Trust, and it was set up in 1926 in order to own Clay Marshes, which is a marsh on the Norfolk coast that was used for shooting wild birds. The second is Lincolnshire Wildlife Trust, which was formed in 1948, which was to take up management on Gibraltar Point. And lastly is Wiltshire Wildlife Trust, which was set up in 1963 to take on Blackmore Copse, one of the last places in the county that was home to the purple emperor butterfly. These are some good examples of why humans have a very important role to play in the environment. And if there are not more actions like this taken, then there's going to be a serious decline in prosperous species or the chance of animals having contact with the industrialized regions. So in refutation of this, there's not going to be many people who disagree with preserving nature or conserving nature, but there are people who disagree that you need both. So they'll say stuff like it's a waste of government time and money to try and fix nature instead of conserve it, and that these people will say that once a habitat is destroyed, that there's no reason to waste that time and that money to try and fix it, but instead just to go aid what's malleable to fix or to like regrow. And that they also believe that the using methods of industrialization is ineffective in these areas. So in response to this refutation, it is pertinent for both of them, preserving and conserving, because it would not be enough to only aid current habitats because of the large number of pre-existing habitats that have already been destroyed by humans from agriculture advances. And what that means is that we can't just, once a habitat's destroyed, we can't just leave it and move on, because at some point we're going to run out of new habitats and space for all these animals if we don't try and fix what's been messed up. And also their point with the government that they should focus more time and resources on aid and preservation of habitats. This doesn't mean that they should eradicate trying to fix the ones that have already been destroyed. So in conclusion, Christian Rawlins was an honest woman who was going about her daily life when she was caught in between a pack of feral pigs who were in an area that they shouldn't have been. Her death could have been prevented if the right actions were taken to help preserve the habitat of these animals, so an interaction such as hers wouldn't possibly happen. Over the course of this defense, there were a few main points looked at. The first was the importance of conservation hunting to wildlife management. The second was God's mandate for man and to have dominion and proper stewardship over the creatures of the earth. And lastly is the importance of preserving and guarding habitats. I'd like to leave all with a quote by Alexander von Humboldt, and it says, "The most dangerous worldview is the worldview of those who have not viewed the world." Thank you.
Good job, Caleb.
Thank you.
Yeah, that was a very methodical analysis and kind of worked your way through that. The point that your second point specifically about the Dominion mandate, I found interesting, and I like what I liked best about it was the issue of accountability you brought into that argument. I don't recall hearing that accountability element introduced into that Dominion mandate before. My question for you maybe is kind of a hypothetical, I don't know. You hear a lot about vegans and vegetarian. You talked about, we're given this kind of responsibility, but at least the freedom to consume animals by God. So does that mean that the vegans slash vegetarian, are they antithetical to God's mandate or God's direction in that sense, or how do you reconcile that?
Well, when I think about that, I think back to, I forget where exactly in the Bible it happens. It's just where David and his friends were, I think they were with King Herod, and they were trying to show that they could eat just, instead of eating like dining with the king, drinking wine, red meat, stuff like that, they instead ate vegetables for I think 10 days or so. And at the end of that time, uh, the David and them who were eating the vegetables, they ended up being in better shape than the people who were dining with the king on all that, I guess, unhealthier food. I wouldn't really say that they're going against God. The way I translate that mandate is just more of, like I said, stewardship, and just being, having proper stewardship when you're doing that. I don't think it might not necessarily be a command that you have to eat the animals, but it's just, if you do, that you need to do it properly and not be wasteful and stuff like that.
Makes perfect sense.
Could I grab a computer charger real quick for the next question?
Certainly.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
think our computer's about to die.
probably needed.
I meant to grab it. My bad.
Hey, Caleb.
Yes, sir.
Hey, good job, man. I'm glad I was able to sign up to see you finish up here for your oral defense, and so good job today. I wanted just to kind of piggyback off of Mr. Lawrence here, and just kind of ask a little more specifically. With I think that there are. When you look at something like Dominion Mandate and somebody like Eric Isaacs that you mentioned, they're speaking from people who hold a whatever view. They're speaking from a particular worldview, and you obviously are speaking from a apparent biblical worldview using Genesis chapter 2, John chapter 3. Genesis 9. I mean, there's several things that you brought up and were using as a defense for your own particular case, and I think that's totally valid. What do you? Whenever I think of someone who might be against what you're talking about, or like Mr. Lawrence was saying, somebody with more of kind of a vegan lifestyle, I'm thinking of organizations like PETA and different organizations like that. It seems to me, my observation is they're speaking from a particular worldview, and it's not a biblical worldview necessarily. It would be, I would think, kind of more of a, we're all equal. You've heard that said before, maybe that we should not be harming wildlife because we're just another species, so to speak, in the world. And who are we to impose on them or whatever? We should do whatever we can. I mean, did you see some of that showing up as far as like a collision, so to speak, of worldviews, biblical versus something else?
Well, that was kind of why I brought up Eric Isaac for the refutation, because I knew there was going to be people who obviously don't have the same worldview as that. So Dominion Mandate, that point of discussion wouldn't really click with them. They're not really going to care about that one as much. Other than him, I really didn't look at it too much. I got the reputation that because he wrote like a whole article on it, and I just kind of got most of my information from him. But the reason I kind of stuck it in there, I kind of stuck it in the middle too, is so even if they didn't have that worldview, they could look at the first point of discussion that I put out in the last one, can still be able to, even without that Christian worldview, be able to pull out the idea that I'm getting to. So they can just completely disregard that second point and just focus on conserving habitats and hunting. Like, because even with Mr. Lawrence brought up about, I think it was like responsibility or something like that with the or accountability. In my first point of discussion with the Boone and Crockett Club and the Ducks Unlimited, when they first started out, we saw where they noticed that they were doing it wrong, and they made changes to what they were doing. So that accountability doesn't just have to come from the Christian worldview; it can come from any worldview, or just pretty much it.
Okay.
Yeah, excellent point. Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, Caleb, if nobody else has any questions, we're a little bit pressed for time. I was impressed with the I guess the casualness and conversationalist quality you had about this. You kind of put this in everyday terms. It was easy to listen to, I thought. You had a good grasp, and it was obviously something in which you believe strongly. So I was appreciative of that. Dude, you're all done, man. This is the last thing you had to do this year.
I was just waiting for this to get done.
Yeah.
I was waiting for Saturday.
Well, I'm proud of you. You have no idea how much you've progressed this year. I know when this year started, boy, getting you to come up here and speak was just like pulling teeth. But you've come a long way. I'm proud of you, bud.
Thank you.
All right. Take care.
All right.
Good job, Caleb.
I'll see y'all this week.
Caleb, enjoyed it, man.
Yes, sir.